Having guaranteed civil rights for our LGBTQ neighbors means we value the health, safety, and dignity of every Mainer. But Mainers, LGBTQ Mainers, should have the same rights they enjoy in our state when they are outside of our state. This Congress must stand together in recognizing the humanity and the civil rights of all LGBTQ people wherever they may live or travel. The Equality Act will ensure LGBTQ citizens have equal access to employment, education, housing credit, and all public services which their tax dollars fund, by the way. It's time to extend these civil rights to everyone, no matter who they love or how they identify. I urge my colleagues in the House to recognize that we must equally protect all members of our community under the law. Let's pass the Equality Act. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. Too many Americans can be fired, evicted, or denied vital services like health care solely because of who they love. The Equality Act protects core American values. Excuse me. LGBTQ rights are civil rights, they're human rights. Participating and contributing equally, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, brings us closer to the self-evident truth that while we are not, Mr. Nadler, I'm going to ask to yield back for a moment.
The gentleman yields back.
I'm going to yield back to you.
Oh, I thank the gentleman.
All right. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
I just got some allergy and couldn't speak. I kept choking. Can I try one more time?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Congressman David Cicilline. Mr. Speaker, in Florida and many other states, LGBTQ Americans are still at risk of being fired, evicted, denied services because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. LGBTQ people confront discrimination throughout their entire lives, from harassment that youth face at school to the bias that older same-sex couples experience when they're denied housing in retirement communities. In the gallery today is Christian Bayless, an openly gay and gender nonconforming student who was barred from delivering his valedictorian speech at his high school on account of his sexuality. 2 nights ago, Christian was honored with the 2019 Hugh F. Hefner First Amendment Award for Education. Today, we will take a crucial step in standing up for people like Christian by passing H.R. 5. 2019 is the 50th anniversary of the uprising at Stonewall and the birth of the modern LGBTQ movement. There is no better way to honor the decades-long struggle for dignity and equality for LGBTQ people than for our elected leaders in Congress to pass this legislation. I'm proud to support H.R. 5.
Thank you. Just a reminder that you're not allowed to reference occupants of the gallery. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
Half minutes.
10 and a half?
10 and a half.
Thank you.
And gentleman is recognized.
Chair.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Too many Americans face severe discrimination because of who they love. LGBTQ rights are civil rights, they're human rights. Participating and contributing equally, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, brings us closer to the self-evident truth that while we are not all created the same, in a just democracy, we are all created equally. Despite state Republican hostility, City of Austin ordinances have long protected against the same discrimination we are combating today. City contractors have complied with these ordinances, whose requirements set the standard for our community. Both Austin and San Antonio enjoy perfect municipal equality index scores from the Human Rights Campaign. With this bill, we set the same type of standard for our entire country. 1,400 businesses in Texas, in the Competes Coalition, have sent a clear message in favor of inclusion and against discrimination. We need strong federal enforcement. That's what this bill does. Do you have another?
No, 30 seconds.
We need strong federal enforcement since local governments have imperfect tools and often have been stifled by narrow-minded state legislatures. No American civil rights should depend upon their zip code. Don't stand in the doorway. Let's pass the Equality Act today. Among many who have been strong advocates for this act, I particularly honor Sam Smoot and Robert Saucedo with Equality Texas, and Julian Tovar and Sissy Yotto with HRC, and of course our colleagues, Congressman Cicilline and Congressman Pocan. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, the chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Mr. Engel.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 5, the Equality Act. Currently, it's legal to fire an individual, prevent access to credit, and even deny or evict someone from their home just because they are LGBT. The Equality Act will guarantee federal protections by ensuring the LGBTQ community is provided full protections under federal civil rights laws. No longer will our fellow Americans be deprived from buying a home, fired from their job, or denied a meal in a restaurant just because of who they are. I am as pleased to help pass this landmark bill today, just as I was back in 1996 when I voted against the discriminatory DOMA, or the so-called Defense of Marriage Act. I urge my colleagues to join me in support of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a fundamental precept of our beautiful country that we have equality for all. But sadly, in this nation, we have not had equality for every person until now. 2/3 of the LGBTQ community have faced discrimination, and this is simply wrong, and it's simply un-American. I thank Mr. Cicilline for bringing this important piece of legislation to the floor. How ironic that my LGBTQ constituents can get married to each other, but still in 29 states can be discriminated against in their jobs, in public education, and even in their jury service. This is wrong, this is un-American, and today's bill, the Equality Act, rights this wrong that has been so long in coming. Congratulations to everybody. I urge all of my colleagues to send a strong bipartisan statement. This is America. Everybody has equal rights in all areas. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is
Mr.
recognized.
Speaker, I reserve as well.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to a distinguished member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee for his leadership, and in particular, Representative Cicilline for his courage and his leadership in bringing this bill to the floor. It is long past time that we end discrimination against those in the LGBT community in our country, and that is why I am so proud to support the Equality Act. Fairness, equality, these are core American values. And yet today, in many states across the United States, Americans can be fired, can be denied a mortgage. They might struggle and be able to obtain housing, all because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. That ends with the passage of the Equality Act. Every American is equal under the law. And so I would say to my friends at Out Boulder County back home, thank you for your activism. To my friends at One Colorado, thank you for your activism. To every LGBTQ American who has stood up and has fought for equality over a generation, I say thank you. And to the members gathered here today, I implore you, let's join together and let's pass the Equality Act today and end discrimination once and for all. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to a distinguished member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank you, Mr. Chair. There are hard votes and there are easy votes. The hard votes involve competing values and difficult trade-offs. The easy ones give us a chance to express our core American values loudly and clearly. H.R. 5 is the right vote, and I thank Representative Cicilline for his hard work and his heart in bringing this piece of justice to us. In most states, same-sex couples can be denied service in restaurants, fired from jobs, evicted from homes with no legal recourse. In other words, they can be mistreated or discriminated against, and their government won't stand up for them. H.R. 5 will end that. This bipartisan legislation will ban discrimination against LGBT people in housing, employment, credit, public accommodations, and so much more. It says that we don't care who you love, but we do care that you are treated with decency and respect. This legislation takes us the next step in a long American tradition of expanding civil rights and protections. It affirms that in this country there is no us and them, it's just us. This is a historic day. I'm proud to be a part of it. Let's cast aside old prejudices and cast a vote for justice and equality. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do we have left? Do I have left?
The gentleman has 5 minutes remaining.
5 or 5.5?
5 minutes remaining for the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan.
Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Equality Act because equality and fairness are core American values. Right now, fairness is not codified in our justice system, and it's long past time to end discrimination. When half of Americans live in a state without legal protections for LGBTQ individuals, that's not equality. When LGBTQ Americans can be fired, evicted, and discriminated against because of who they are, who they love, or how they identify, that is not justice. The opportunity before us is a historic one. I want to thank my colleagues who led the effort to bring this bill to the floor. My colleagues who vote no on this will be judged. This is something that we should be working on together, Mr. Speaker. We will pass the Equality Act for the dignity of all Americans. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Members are reminded to remove their conversations from the floor. The House will be in order. Members will remove their conversations from the floor, please. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, the conscience of the House, Mr. Lewis.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my friend from New York for yielding. David, my friend and my brother, thank you for your leadership. Today is May 17th. On May 17, 1954, the United States Supreme Court issued a decision. I remember that decision. I was 17 years old. I thought I would be attending desegregated school. It never happened for me. Today, on this day, we have an opportunity to send a message now to help end discrimination in our country and set all of our people free. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair will remind all persons in the gallery that they are here as guests of the House and that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings is a violation of the rules of the House. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, the distinguished Majority Leader of the House, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I regret that the chamber is not full of members, or that the gallery is not jammed with people. For this is an historic day. Many members have quoted that extraordinary doctrine of civil rights and human rights articulated by our founders 243 years ago. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I tell people that they may be self-evident, but they are not self-executing. Today, we will take another step in a long journey towards a more perfect union. Today, we will take a step, and hopefully, as it was in 1957 when we passed the Civil Rights Act that year, hopefully it will be as it was in 1964 when we passed that civil rights bill. And hopefully it will be as we voted on the Disabilities Act in 1990. All of those bills were passed in a bipartisan fashion. And yes, there were bipartisan votes against those bills, some from my party and some from my colleagues on the Republican side. And my presumption is, and my hope is, that those who voted no on those civil rights bills looked back and said, I made a mistake. That was not the vote I should have made. Every Democrat will vote for this bill. Every Democrat will stand up and say, this is another step in the quest for a better America, a more just America, a more accepting America. That is what we have the opportunity to do today, and I hope that many, if not all, of my Republican colleagues will stand not for party, not for policies of party or partisanship, but stand for principles enunciated 243 years ago, but still not yet fully realized. That's what this day is about. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this bill, which I know will pass, but I hope, as I have said, it passes with a very strong bipartisan conviction and confirmation of the fact that we hold these truths to be self-evident. This is an opportunity for the House to come together and reject discrimination and exclusion. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of the bill that Mr. Cicilline put forward. The Equality Act is about America. It's about who we are, and what we believe. I want to commend the LGBT community and the Equality Caucus for being at the forefront of promoting full equality, equal justice, and equal opportunity for LGBTQ people and their families in this country. The world looks to us as the strongest supporter historically of human rights and equal rights. Have we always been so? No, we have not. My party was the segregationist party for many years, and we said no to that. We walked away from that. We said that was not the party we were going to be. And of course, all of us were not members of that part of the party. But this day, we should all stand and say, yes, we believe that all men and all women and all people are created equal by God and endowed not by the Constitution, not by this body, but endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the right to live as you are. Yes, we make judgments on what you may do, but not who you are. You may be black. You may be white. You may be a woman. You may be a man. You may be a homosexual. You may be a lesbian. You may be a trans. You may be anything other than what I am. But you're entitled from me and from your country respect and equal treatment. As we said 243 years ago, sadly, some states still permit discrimination against LGBT people in those areas that have been discussed. We need to put an end to that and ensure that all people in this country, no matter where they live, are protected against hate and bigotry, exclusion, and discrimination. The opportunities this country offers must be open to everyone in our country. When I first ran for office in 1966 for a seat in the Maryland State Senate, fair housing was the issue. And the proposition was you didn't have to sell your house to somebody whose color was different than yours, even though they had the ability to buy it, and they wanted to move into that neighborhood. This issue that we consider today is different in particular, but not in the principle. That idea is that the very core of our American society, that opportunities exist for all of our people. Throughout our history, we've reinforced this idea with the passage of the 14th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the 64 Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and others. We uphold this commitment to fair and more just society with passage of this Equality Act. Surely we ought to be able to agree. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives, Northeast, South, and West, surely we can agree that all men and all women are created equal and are deserving of equal treatment. Let's come together and make that promise of our founders ring true. The Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself. Not love your straight neighbor, not love your Christian neighbor, not love your white neighbor, not love your native-born neighbor, not love your neighbor of some other distinction, but love your neighbor as yourself. That means, in my view, love your gay neighbor. Love your lesbian neighbor. Love your trans neighbor. It means love your Muslim neighbor. Love your Jewish neighbor. Love your African American, Latino, and Asian American neighbor. Love your immigrant neighbor. Love your neighbor, not your hyphenated neighbor, because we're all created equal. Martin Luther King, a century after the Civil War, said to America, "You are not living out the promise of America." He called us to conscience. He called us to be America. He called us to be that light to the rest of the world. And so today we say we will judge on content of character. We will be America. We will be the best we can be of America. Let us, like we did on so many of the civil rights bills that have come before us again, let us vote overwhelmingly to confirm America's promise to its people and to the world. Vote for this critically important statement of America's values, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I would inquire my...
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I was just going to inquire my chairman if he has any more speakers or if we were ready to close.
I was about to ask you the same thing. We have no further speakers. I'm prepared to close.
And I am too, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we've went through a lot of debate. We've heard a lot of issues today. And again, one of the issues that, please find it for me, that I want to bring up today is again, as I started out in my opening statement, this is not a matter that there's no one on our side and no one who disagrees with this bill is saying anyone ought to be treated wrongly, badly, in any way. By who they are. That's not who we are. In fact, we've struggled with that seemingly on this floor. But this bill, I can agree with the intent. I agree with the fact that no one should be. But my friend, the majority leader, just made a statement. He quoted a scripture, and he added, and it was a good one. He said, love your neighbor. And I agree with him. I've talked about it. I've preached out of many years now. But it also didn't say love your neighbor, and then I have to agree with my neighbor. We can love each other and disagree. And when we love each other and disagree, we come into this place of this bill. And that's where it gets not the amorphous, not the intent, not what we want to do to make us feel better. It actually is how do we then legislate this? And this bill is just not a good attempt. It's an imperfect step toward making something that others want to be right, but in the end runs a real risk of causing others harm at the same time. It is a risk that is brought on by rushing something, and even if it has been talked about for 5 years, the legislative part has been rushed, Mr. Speaker, and I understand the concern. I understand the anxiety, but let's make it right. Let's at least have an open debate. Let's discuss here. It's interesting to me that we had to have a colloquy on the floor to assuage some members that they would not be attacked in there, or that this bill would not attack a worship service, or who could lead a worship service, or if a minister would actually have to do a service that would be against their personal faith beliefs. The bill does not talk about that, but it does leave an open issue of public accommodation. And how would somebody actually look at public accommodation in a church setting? That's an honest question that needs to be answered. But it does bring up a lot of questions. Is what if a church or a religious organization accepts federal money? What if a Catholic church who accepts school lunch programs? What if a Jewish synagogue who accepts money for homeland security? Is it then at that point for the programs that they have to do, because the bill actually says if you receive federal money, you fall under this, do they then have to violate their own faith beliefs? Making one group of people deny their faith while trying to give another one a leg up is still wrong. It's not equal. So the questions that we have here today is honest disagreement. It's honest disagreement that not in the sense of you take this, you've made a gender identity claim that is self-professing. Also, as just said just a moment ago, we talked about great ideas like the Civil Rights Act and the ADA. The ADA, disability under the ADA can be shown objectively. Shown objectively. And I agree, as a father of a daughter who has spina bifida, is in a wheelchair, I can show objectively what that actually means, and I am proud of that legislation. I was not here. I wish I had been, because I've seen it open up. But in this bill, it says simply gender identity as I proclaim it at that moment.
Gentleman's time
This
has
is
expired.
where our problems come. And with that, Mr. Speaker, is why I would say vote no on a bill that has been
Gentleman's
rushed
time
to
has
the floor.
expired. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of our time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this morning we have heard phantom fears about the allegedly harmful effects of the Equality Act on religious freedom and women's rights. But if these fears had any basis in reality, the Equality Act would not have been endorsed by more than 500 civil rights, women's rights, religious, medical, and other national and state organizations, including the American Medical Association, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Episcopal Church, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the NAACP, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, the National Women's Law Center, Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, the Rabbinical Assembly, and the United Methodist Church General Board of Church and Society. It has also been endorsed by dozens of business associations, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the Sports and Fitness Industry Association. Mr. Speaker, the time has come to proclaim liberty and equality throughout the land. Mr. Speaker, I now commend the bill to the judgment of the House, and I commend the House to the judgment of history. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 377, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on the engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 5 is postponed. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote. neighbors voted. On this vote, the yeas are 211, the nays are... Mr. Green of Texas. Mr. Green of Texas votes aye. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes no. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Tassanier. Mr. Tassanier votes aye. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes no. On this vote, the yeas are 215, the nays are 191, with one member voting present. The ayes have it. The journal stands approved. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 5 will now resume. The clerk will report the title.
Union Calendar number 34, H.R. 5, a bill to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and for other purposes.
The House will come to order. The House will be in order. Members will remove their conversations from the floor. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am in its present form.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Stubbe of Florida moves to recommit the bill H.R. 5 to the Committee on the Judiciary with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. Add at the end of the bill the following. Section 13, Rule of Construction. Nothing in this act or any amendment made by this act may be construed to diminish any protections under Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972.
The House will come to order. Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to make it abundantly clear exactly what this motion to recommit does, so I'm going to read it. It's very short. Nothing in this act or any amendment made by this act may be construed to diminish any protections under Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. The threat that this bill possesses for women's sports at every level is profound. As described by the nation's leading expert on sports, sex, and biology, Professor Doreen Lamblett-Coleman, she states, there is a significant performance difference between males and females. Testosterone is the primary driver of that difference. There is a wide gap, no overlap, between the male and female testosterone ranges. There is no scientific doubt that testosterone is the reason that men as a group perform better than women in sports. Indeed, this is why men and women dope with androgens. Requiring that biological females face competition from biological males will mean the end of women's sports in any meaningful sense. As tennis great Martina Navratilova has written in the Washington Post, in its current form, the Equality Act would do significant damage to Title IX and to the Amateur Sports Act, which governs sports outside of educational settings.
It's correct. The House is not in order. Gentleman is recognized.
The new legislation would amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act by redefining sex to include gender identity. Without an exception, the definition would apply to all amendments to the 1964 Act, including Title IX. Most schools, colleges, the NCAA, and the Olympic Committee would be affected because they receive federal funds and operate in interstate commerce. The legislation would make it unlawful to differentiate among girls and women in sports on the basis of sex for any purpose. For example, a sports team couldn't treat a transgender woman differently from a woman who is not transgender on the grounds that the former is male-bodied. Yet the reality is that putting male and female-bodied athletes together is co-ed or open sport, and in open sport, females lose. Some Equality Act advocates argue that this is hyperbole and outdated stereotype. They say, as the ACLU has, that there is ample evidence that girls can compete and win against boys. They are wrong. The evidence is unequivocal that starting in puberty in every sport except sailing, shooting, and riding, there will always be significant numbers of boys and men who would beat the best girls and women in head-to-head competition. Claims to the contrary are simply a denial of science. Those are not my words. Those are the words of female tennis great Martina Navratilova. And footnote 44 of the committee report on this bill, the Democrat majority states, the committee acknowledges that the addition of sex as a protected characteristic under Title VI of the bill raises some questions about how the revised Title VI should be read in relation to Title IX of the Education Amendment. It is the committee's intention not to alter in any way Title IX or the scope or availability of its exemptions as they currently stand. Rather, Title IX and the revised Title VI should be read as being complementary provisions that provide overlapping protection against sex discrimination, unquote. But of course, we all know that allowing biological males to compete against biological females is not an overlapping protection. It is instead a violation of women's rights to engage in competitive sports on an even playing field and to enjoy the protection of their own spaces reserved for biological females. And so this motion to recommit is essential to protecting the rights of women and girls in sports that H.R. 5 currently denies. Even the Obama administration wrote a letter to schools regarding Title IX enforcements, making clear that they should continue to be able to enforce policies that are, quote, tailored requirements based on sound, current, and research-based medical knowledge about the impact of the individual's participation on the competitive fairness or physical safety of the sport. Adoption of this motion to recommit will not kill the bill. It will not delay the bill's consideration. If this motion to recommit is adopted, the bill proceeds directly to final passage. If H.R. 5 becomes law, our daughters will be asking us, what did you do when moves were made to eliminate women's sports? It's worth considering that question now before it's too late. I urge all my colleagues to join me in protecting Title IX and protecting women's sports and supporting this motion to recommit.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
To oppose the motion to recommit with all of my heart.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I can't believe that we're standing here and having a man tell me what kind of protections I need in sports.